like if I were to think about all the different characters there are, I don't know. I probably would want to say Bilbo.
Yeah. What is it about Bilbo?
And I don't know when. I guess there are a few different things. I mean, Bilbo, he's someone who's just kind of and isn't really
Mhm.
interested about going on an adventure. Um, but then, but then of course the adventure comes to him, and and so he ends
Mhm.
up going on this great journey that he never really expected. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know. That's it. In some ways, I feel like that kind of describes my life a little bit. Just kind of you know didn't really expect kind of a lot of things to happen, and then kind of ended up on a journey that's taken me to places I've never thought I would.
Have you I mean this sounds like it echoes the story of Finian, I think your first comic, right? And that same call to adventure and he's young and he ends up going on a great big saga and well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So hey everybody and welcome. Today we're joined by Philip Kozlowski. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, that's good.
Cool.
Close enough.
Philip Kozlowski is the founder of Voyage Comics, and he's got a number of different actual comics out there. And you can see if you're watching on YouTube, it's kind of a little bit of the art behind us. It just looks incredibly cool. This looks like a sort of Christian Catholic Marvel kind of thing going on, which is awesome. So we're going to get into that in his story in just a second. This show is called Legend Makers. It's interviews, convos about legend fiction, the creative community for Catholic and Orthodox fiction writers. We're talking creed, craft, and co-creation rooted in grit, grace, gods, and dragons. We're all about inspiring your faith and your fiction. Philip, before diving into your fiction, what's your origin story? How did you get to a point where you're doing all of this stuff?
Sure. Well, I definitely never expected to be a writer. I kind of growing up, never really had high hopes. I actually wasn't very much of a reader. Um, and then, um, kind of, so after high school, I ended up kind of discerning God's call and entered the seminary for a few years
Oh,
and
really?
then kind of decided that or discovered that God was not calling me to the priesthood. So then I was left again in a kind of spirit of discernment to kind of figure out. So now what? What is kind of God leading me to? And initially, I kind of started work at a parish, and a few years into it, I stumbled upon this. It's called the St. Catherine of Siena Institute, and they have this program. It's about discerning your charism, and it's a really neat program because it you kind of go through a class and then you kind of discern like what kind of gives you peace and um what do you think you're good at and what do you enjoy doing, and kind of through that discernment process I discovered that I enjoyed writing, and then as I started to kind of venture off into this writing, initially I was just kind of writing for my own blog, just kind of spirituality articles. And um, what was interesting is that, you know, without really having any idea that I would end up writing for a living, um, it didn't take too long, maybe a year or two. And then kind of showed, kind of was pointing me in the direction that, um, I'd be um, going away from parish ministry and to writing full time. And so I started doing that about 6 years or so, writing mainly for um, some spirituality websites, like Alatea, National Catholic Register.
Hmm.
And then, kind of as I was kind of starting this writing career, I guess, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think every writer kind of has this sense of like, well, what book am I going to write? I don't know.
Mhm.
For some reason, it seems, yeah, you kind of you have this dream of what you're going to write, and I don't know. I mean, I started thinking about writing kind of a fictional story and started writing, but it just wasn't working.
Mhm.
And it just I was having a really hard time writing, and it just wasn't coming out very great. And then I'm not quite sure how exactly I came upon comic books, but I was just kind of thinking, how can I, well, I guess just kind of back up a second. So one thing I was thinking about, this was shortly after the Star Wars: The Force Awakens came
Mhm.
out into theaters, and one thing that fascinated me about it was that at the very end of the movie, it showed this beautiful image of this monastery, and after doing a little investigating, I found out that it was a real monastery off the coast of Ireland,
Mhm.
and so what I was kind of fascinated about the parallels between real Catholic monks living there, and then now in the Star Wars universe, these Jedi that were
Mhm.
living there, kind of as these spiritual warriors.
It's like a
So
coincidence sort of echo lining up history and fiction.
yeah, yeah, and so that was part of the reason why I wanted to kind of figure out a way to make that connection, and to do it in a way that was entertaining, and so this idea of a comic book kind of rose. And you know initially, and at this point I had no experience writing comic books or making comic books, and
Mhm.
I didn't really know anyone who would be doing the artwork or anything. So this is just totally out of left field, I guess you could say. um
So we're now at a point where it seems like Bilbo has accepted the call to adventure, and and so now the adventure begins. But I want to go back and ask you, like, um, what was it that wasn't working when you said you were trying to write the story? Was it like a story or a novel? And what was just not working for you?
yeah, it was. I mean, I'm not quite sure what it would have grown into, but yeah, essentially just a fictional kind of fantasy story. And it's, I mean, partly I don't know, I wasn't feeling very confident about it, and um, it was just it's just really, I mean, really difficult, and
Mhm.
like in terms of a narrative style of writing. um, and it was, yeah, just one of those things where I just wasn't making any progress.
Mhm.
um, and I don't know, I kind of just abandoned it at a certain point.
Gotcha.
um,
Well, then let me turn the question around. Then, what is it then that comics opened up for you, or graphic novels, that just it clicked or it worked? Is it just a different medium and it's how you approach things, and just being more visual changes things?
yeah, I mean, so that's just kind of the interesting thing. So I started to learn about comic book writing, the script writing process,
Mhm.
and somehow it just came very easily to me.
Mhm.
And it's just where I could just was very confident in the script writing, where I was able to put kind of the images I have in my mind uh, onto the page,
Mhm.
in words. and and I don't know, I kind of took that as maybe God's kind of leading me in that direction, that yeah, I just kind of felt a lot of peace about it. And at the same time, um, so kind of just to step back a second, like, so when I was thinking of this comic book idea,
Hmm.
so I still had this blog I was reading for, and I kind of opened the idea of, comic books, kind of questioning my readers, just saying, I was thinking about this idea. And then, um, and it so happened that one of my readers was good friends with this Catholic artist who worked for Marvel for 30 years.
That
And
explains
then,
it then. Okay.
um, and then there was another reader who he worked for Disney for like 20 years.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and and so, you know, God kind of kept on putting these people into my life that I never really expected. Like I had
Hmm.
no connection to anyone in the comic book industry, but then
Hmm.
suddenly I did. Um, and and I was very grateful for that because, I found while it was, you know, easier to do a comic book script, I needed someone else
Hmm.
to show me, to show me how to perfect it. And I was very grateful for, even though he wasn't a comic book writer, the artist, he was able to, kind of help me create it in a certain way that I never expected it to. So kind of like I had this idea for a comic book, and I was, gonna just write this one comic book, and then he showed me kind of, well, really you should do this. And then I kind of changed it mid course, and then it turned out to be much better
Hmm.
than it was in the end.
Amazing. So let's dive into some of that. What are some of the comic books or graphic novels that you've created?
Sure. Yeah. So the Finnian series was the first series that we created about 5 years ago or so,
Hmm.
and that we're just about to release the sixth issue,
Amazing.
um, and the seventh issue is also in progress, and that one's kind of brings that series to a conclusion.
Wow.
Um, and then, so that's kind of a fantasy, historical fantasy fiction kind of
Hmm.
genre. Um, and it looks at, there's these kind of medieval legends about Saint Michael and the kind of sword of Saint Michael. And so I kind of investigate those, and, and kind of throughout all of my stories, what I try to do is kind of look at these, like how in in medieval stories or saint stories, there's all these like fantastical events. And
Hmm.
so I kind of choose to portray those fantastic events in visuals. So, like, for example, we did one on Saint Joan of Arc, and in her story, she says that she saw, Saint Michael. Um, so that's what happens in the comic book. She sees Saint Michael,
Hmm.
and he helps her. So yeah, and then
Wow,
we
that's
also
awesome.
have uh, a superhero series that we started called the Phantom Phoenix, and
Cool.
that's been fun, kind of jumping into the superhero genre. Um,
I've got to ask then. It's a different genre. It's not kind of fantasy historical. It's now what, more modern, obviously drama, Marvel, I guess. What were some of the big differences in storytelling, or like creating a character? Like, how many issues have you done of the superhero, the
so
Flaming Phoenix?
we've done 2 issues of the Phantom Phoenix.
Phantom Phoenix, pardon me. Okay. So, what have been some of the big differences that you have found in crafting these stories?
Yeah, so it's been a little bit different, but we set it in the 1920s.
Okay.
And so it kind of, so it's modern, but it's also in, 100 years ago. So you kind of have a little bit of, um, I don't know, I guess something that's kind of foreign to a modern reader.
Mhm.
But I don't know, it's been interesting too, because while we like to kind of root the stories in you know history, so we also kind of expand that a little bit and kind of test the boundaries of that,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to like a superhero in the 1920s, what kind of gadgets they have and things like that.
So what
um,
kind of a superhero is it? Is he powered, or is it more Batman with gadgets, or what's the arc of that story like?
yeah, I mean, it's more along of yeah, Batman, in terms of, yeah, he doesn't have kind of supernatural powers.
Mhm.
Um, and and yeah, it was interesting too, just kind of you know basing the story within the Catholic realm as well. So I mean, creating things that wouldn't necessarily conflict with kind of a Catholic worldview.
Mhm.
um but then it's still just kind of, yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of fun kind of exploring how to make a Catholic superhero.
How so that's so intriguing to me. I mean, the closest I can imagine is like well, Daredevil that Netflix put together, and there's a lot of faith wrestling, especially around violence and guilt and whatever. What were some of the things that you ran up against in dramatizing a Catholic superhero?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the issues we think about, like the violence. Like, so if there were a Catholic superhero, like what is his mode of operation? Like,
Mhm.
does he kill people, or does he
Mhm.
just capture them? How does he disable them? How does he work with the police? you
Mhm.
know and kind of, yeah, there's a lot of dynamics to kind of explore,
Mhm.
um in that genre. And yeah, and the same way with Finnian as well. Like, we have a lot of, um there's human enemies, but then there's also kind of spiritual enemies that are kind of like beasts and dragons and things like that.
Mhm.
So just kind of exploring how to portray violence in a Catholic way.
Mhm. Can you unpack that a little bit, like how you've walked around that or wrestled with that? So, portraying violence in a Catholic way, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, because you have this kind of point of view of from our Catholic faith that each person has dignity,
Mhm.
um, that you respect them, but then you also have to recognize the self-defense and you know engaging people who are threatening your life.
Yeah, the demands of the
um,
moment.
yeah, and so, yeah, it's a lot of kind of, and then you also have kind of the variety of characters too. So I mean, you have your hero, which is kind of the main character, and kind of the main person that you want to be kind of consistent with the
Mhm.
Catholic faith. But then you can also have kind of other characters who may not be as virtuous, um, and you kind of have to kind of figure out how to show that, and how to show their journey as well.
Mhm. Nice, nice. And yeah, I agree. I agree with you. Um, what are some of the other projects that you're working on? Your website has Carlo Acutis on there. What's that all about?
Sure. Yeah. So over the last few years as well, in addition to kind of creating our own original content, we've also been contacted by a few different organizations to create comic books on the lives of saints, or saints in the progress. So
Mhm.
um, the first one we did with that is Father Patrick Peyton. He's widely known for the phrase, "The family that prays together stays together." And so we did a comic book on his life, and then we also did a comic book on the life of a Wisconsin priest called Father Joe Walieski, and he's just he was a missionary in Peru. Just had a very inspiring story. And then, yeah, most recently we did another one on Carlo Cutis, and his is another kind of fascinating story, especially since he, you know, he died very recently, and kind of was a very normal teenager.
So are you the primary storyteller, and then you have a couple of artists that you work with?
Yeah. So for all of these, so far I've been just the primary writer. I've over over the years I have been able to get in contact with some other um, writers, comic book writers, and that's been very helpful too. Just kind of more established writers who can take a look at my scripts and tell me, what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong, and that's been very helpful for me to grow as a writer.
Sure. I'm curious, what's been one piece of advice maybe that you've received that was just incredibly helpful, and it changed maybe something for you, or reoriented how you were working on a story?
Sure. Well, for me, it's always kind of learning more about the comic book format. Because it's very action oriented, so you want to try to emphasize the action, but what's interesting is it doesn't always have to be like fighting, especially with these biographies of different saints we've done,
Yeah, there's
they
no.
don't, yeah, they don't have any extraordinary violence. So what you have to do is you have to use kind of camera angles and zooming in, zooming out, and kind of a lot of different things to kind of show action, and then to craft your page in a way where it leads to the next page where you want to keep turning the page.
Yeah. I imagine the process is so different. I mean, I've interviewed on this channel with people who make children's books, and you're the first comic artist or comic creator that we've chatted with. But they've talked about stuff like, I'll outline a little bit of where the story needs to go, and then there's a ton of collaboration that happens with an artist, but they're maybe just creating spreads or something. And in your case, it is so much more intensive. I imagine an artist might push back and say, hey, we don't need to say all that stuff because we can draw it, or just make a camera angle or show something happening. And what does that dynamic look like in creating in creating a full comic book? How does that process work, I should ask?
Yeah, for comic books, it's definitely a very collaborative project as well. Because I'll have kind of an idea of what I think will go on the page, but then when the artist sees it, then he might say, well, I think actually this would look better, and so things will get adjusted, or maybe if I had something that would go on for a few pages, maybe the artist would suggest you could actually do it in one page, or 2 pages instead of 3. So yeah, I think it is very helpful. Yeah, it's I think in any endeavor, it's really important to be open to criticism or corrections, and not to be too defensive when it comes to the story that you created. It may not end up being exactly what you thought, but it probably will be a better product.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I want to correct myself. I have actually interviewed a previous graphic novel guy, Douglas Ernst with Soul Finder. So you're the second. So it's cool to chat more with people like you. I'm curious to ask a question about your inspiration, perhaps growing up? You referenced Lord of the Rings. Were there any stories or legends growing up that now that you're older, you look back and realize they were very formative, or they really impacted you, and you think back on them, maybe work them into your stories? Do you have anything like that?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, definitely, yeah. Like I said, Lord of the Rings, and I definitely was very big into Star Wars as a child. So that definitely impacts me.
Hmm.
I mean, I was well, I didn't have like a very large comic book library. I did have some comic books. I you know I was also interested in other adaptations of comic books, so like cartoons, or they just were just beginning to kind of put together movies based on the comic books.
Hmm.
Um, and even as I write comic books now, I still, that both Marvel and DC have been very, there's been kind of a revival in the last 10, 20 years. And they've been much more into pop culture than it was. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I'd say those are kind of the primary ones that kind of formed me as a kid.
Nice. What's been the response to these comic books? You have people have enjoyed them, or has it created interesting conversations? Like, how are people taking the drama and the magic that you're creating here?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very positive. I mean, you know, like I've said, we've only been doing this for about 5 years or so,
Mhm.
but we've been able to grow kind of each year, and yeah, there's been definitely a very positive response, and kind of one of the things that we try to focus on is kind of quality stories and
Mhm.
quality artwork. Because we know that I don't know, it can be tempting sometimes just to make something that's Christian and sell it because people think it's Christian, and that's kind of the only reason why.
Yeah. As
But we
opposed
want
to
it,
actually having a good story that sticks with you.
yeah, we want it to actually be good, so that even someone who isn't Catholic or isn't even Christian, that they could pick it up and they could
Mhm.
enjoy it. They
Yeah.
may not get everything that's in it, um, that it's at the core of it, it's a good story, and
Mhm.
it's quality artwork as well.
Brilliant, brilliant. So what's next for you all? You have what kinds of new projects are you working towards?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're excited at the different project that can be. I mean, we want to continue the superhero project, and see how big it can and get. I mean, there's you know we have kind of like this map of this kind of universe that we want to create, but it's
Like
always
like a superhero universe?
essentially, yeah. and
Oh,
and
cool.
we want to get to the point where we can, but it's when you're starting off doing it all, um you don't have the big bucks like Marvel does, so
Mm,
it takes
right.
a little bit slower to do.
Yeah.
Um, but
From like a sort of a business marketing standpoint, being a creative, what is that like for you? How do you uh, reach audiences and so on? How do you market and grow?
sure, yeah. I mean, it's been you know kind of a slow grind, I guess you could say. I mean, besides kind of appearing on different podcasts and such to kind of help promote. I mean, otherwise, I mean, I've been able to get some attention in the Catholic media, which has been helpful.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, it's definitely been one of those things too, where it's just kind of word of mouth,
Okay.
where it's grown slowly over the years, but then it gets bigger each time, just because your audience gets bigger, and then they tell
Mhm.
their friends, and so.
Yeah.
It's definitely, yeah, we didn't have like one explosive moment
Hmm.
in our 5 years, but it's been kind of
Sure.
gradual each year.
I think a lot of writers and authors can empathize and get that, and then on the one hand, there's the sense of just sticking to it year over year, just putting out that creativity and allowing the audience to grow. But heck, at the same time, would be nice to get more of that attention. I did have another question, and oh, you had mentioned that you now work full time for Voyage Comics. Did I get that right?
Well, I not entirely. So not
Okay,
in the sense just for Voyage Comics. I'm still a full-time writer is probably what I said. And so
gotcha. Okay,
I do write, but um,
like
Voyage is
nonfiction
still,
articles or like for Alatea, that sort of thing.
yeah. So still
Okay.
writing articles and things like that. And so my work for Voyage is, increasing over the years, but it's still not
Hmm.
not the main job yet.
Gotcha. No, I hear you. Um, Oh, yeah, you've just raised like especially the superhero one. I want to go back and ask a little bit about that, creating the story for that as we start to wrap up. How so you said it in the 1920s, and you kind of made him Catholic. Why the name? What's the inspiration for Phantom Phoenix?
Um, well, I mean, I guess the phoenix is kind of an interesting Christian symbol of kind of resurrection and rebirth,
Hmm.
and so our character is one who he was in World War I and kind of got injured, but
Mm,
then kind of through some various circumstances discovered kind of his role in the world, and so kind of experienced kind of a rebirth in sense of his personal mission.
nice. Okay. Um, in creating characters, how do you make good guys interesting? And I guess part of that is like bad guys realistic too. What are some things that you turn to as you're creating these stories, or maybe it's out of collaboration with the artists as well? But how do you make the good guys feel interesting? Because when they're automatically good, sometimes they can start to feel wooden, and I think a lot of authors struggle with that. What have been your ways of handling that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think probably one of the keys is just that your character has a story, has a history,
Mhm.
and it doesn't have to be perfect, and it's probably better if it isn't perfect. But that wherever you meet this character in his journey, um, like you kind of have a clear sense of where he's been and kind of where you kind of hoped to take him. But
Mhm.
um, yeah, I mean, I don't know, even with saints, saints weren't they weren't always perfect in the sense
Mhm.
of they grew and they became saints. They
Mhm.
weren't born saints. So
Yeah.
I think
That's
that's
a
always.
great little point. Since you've created now 3 different comics around saints, and then you've crafted those stories, how did you um how did you make the saints then interesting in to you, like selling them to you as like a character that you like, and then of course they're going to spend a ton of time with creating and then sharing with other people to follow their journeys. It's so easy to kind of again flatline the saints as being these models. And um, how did you make them come alive for you?
Well, I mean, I think it's always helpful to find points of contact, like where maybe different stories or events that happened in that person's life
Hmm.
that you could relate to, that kind of connects with your story.
Yes.
um,
Okay.
and yeah, I think that's always with any saint. It seems like when you're able to find something in that person's story that you can relate to, that it makes them much more enjoyable to learn about.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, um, Voyage Comics. Why the name? Why did you pick Voyage?
Well, I mean, I've just kind of always, well, kind of one one quote that I always loved is by Saint Therese, is that like the world is your ship and not your home. And so I've just found that idea just kind of helps me in the spiritual life, but then also just kind of it's kind of how I want all of the stories that we produce to kind of image or mirror, like that, these stories show us that our life here is that we're on a journey, and that we're going to
Mhm.
somewhere. We're trying to journey towards heaven, and so that's
Mhm.
kind of where Voyage comes into play.
It's intriguing. That's something that I've been trying to find in myself, is that underline, that story that's beneath all of the different stories that I'm telling. And I think every author has something like that. And it's cool that you've discovered it, and then you made it part of the mission, part of the brand. How can people get in touch with you? How can they find you online and check out your comic books and buy them?
Sure, yeah. So just if you head on over to voyagecomics.com, you can find everything there, or also on social media as well. Yeah, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Um, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, in just a second, I want to ask you to give or to share a 1-minute message of encouragement. And for those who have not heard of this show before, Legend Makers, like I said, it's brought to you by LegendFiction, which is a creative community for Catholic and Orthodox fiction writers. It's a place to give and get feedback, uh, share your works in progress, maybe even double your writing output, because it's just so much fun. Come and check out and join our private community at legendfiction.com. If you had 1 minute, Philip, to share a message of encouragement to faith-inspired authors, what would you want to say?
Well, I'd say just keep on writing. That even if you think what you're writing isn't that great or isn't that powerful, the greatest thing you can do is just keep writing, and to let God kind of take you on a journey to find how He wants to use your talents.